The first forecast that couldn't exist arrived on a Tuesday in March, 14 hours before the atmosphere had any reason to produce what it described. I need to be specific about that because specificity is the only thing I have left that I trust. 14 hours, not a vague sense that something was coming, not a barometric trend suggesting possibility. A complete surface forecast, wind speed, direction, precipitation type, visibility, ceiling height, temperature, all of it exactly right, all of it generated and time-stamped when the nearest relevant moisture was still 600 miles west over the Pacific. I didn't understand what I was seeing yet. At the time, I assumed I'd misread the timestamp. Love dark atmospheric stories? Subscribe and join the vault. And tell me the moment that unsettled you most. I read every comment. My name is Garrett Holm. I'm a contracted weather observer for the National Weather Service Cooperative Observer Program, stationed at a high-altitude automated surface observing site in the Wind River Range of western Wyoming. The station sits at 9,240 feet on a broad saddle between two ridge lines, accessible by a single gravel road that becomes impassable between November and April. During those months, I live on site in a small residential module adjacent to the instrument compound. The rest of the year I drive up from Lander 3 days a week. The contract pays $31,000 a year, plus housing. During winter residency, I took it after my position at the Riverton Forecast Office was eliminated in a restructuring. I was 43. I had 17 years of observation experience, a failed marriage, whose geography I needed to leave, and no interest in relocating to a city. The station was isolated, but the work was familiar surface observations, equipment calibration, radio sonde prep, data quality control. I knew how to read instruments. I knew how to read sky. I knew the difference between what the atmosphere was doing and what I wanted it to be doing. That distinction used to be simple. The station's primary equipment is an ASOS unit automated surface observing system, ceilometer, anemometer, temperature, and dew point sensors, a tipping bucket precipitation gauge, visibility sensor, and a pressure transducer. My job isn't to replace the automation, it's to augment it. The ASOS takes a reading every minute. I take a reading every hour during my shift, verify it against the automated data, note any discrepancies, and file a METR, a formatted weather observation that feeds into the national data stream. At the end of each shift, I record a spoken summary into a digital log. Equipment status, notable conditions, anything the instruments might miss that a trained observer wouldn't. I always end with the same phrase. Surface observation complete. It's not required. It's just a habit I developed years ago in Riverton, a way of closing out the mental space of the shift so I could walk away cleanly. I mention that phrase because it becomes important later. I was wrong to think it was just a habit. March in the Wind River Range is still winter. The snowpack was deep that year, and I was in full residency, meaning I hadn't left the station in 6 weeks. The road wouldn't open until late April at the earliest. I had supplies delivered by a contracted helicopter service once every 3 weeks, and I had radio and internet contact with Jenna Marsh, my NWS coordinator, based in Riverton. Jenna handled data quality for 4 cooperative stations across the region. We spoke 2 or 3 times a week, usually about calibration issues or formatting errors in my METR submissions. Jenna was practical, dry-humored, and efficient. She didn't waste words. When I eventually told her what was happening, her silence was more unnerving than anything she could have said. But that came later. The Tuesday forecast. I woke at 0500 locale, which was my standard start, made coffee, pulled up the overnight ASOS data on my terminal to check for sensor faults or flagged readings. Everything nominal. Clear sky, winds west-northwest at 8 knots, temperature minus 14 Celsius, barometric pressure at 29.82 inches. I noted the pressure because it had been holding at exactly 29.82 for 3 consecutive readings, which is unusual. Pressure fluctuates. Even in stable high-pressure systems, you get minor oscillation. 3 identical readings in a row across 3 hours suggested either genuine atmospheric stillness or a sensor fault. I flagged it for manual verification, went outside, and checked the mercury barometer in the instrument shelter, 29.82. I accepted it. Atmospheres do hold still sometimes, especially at altitude in late winter. I logged the manual confirmation, filed my 0600 meter, and continued my morning routine. At 0740, I checked the station's incoming data feed. This is a secondary function. The ASOS primarily sends data outward to the NWS, but it also receives text-based products from the regional forecast office. Routine stuff, area forecasts, watches, warnings, SIGMETs for aviation. I scan them each morning to compare the official outlook with what I'm observing locally. There was a product I didn't recognize. It was formatted like a zone forecast, the kind of plain language prediction the NWS issues for specific geographic areas. It covered my station zone. It described conditions for the following 24-hour period. But the header was wrong. Zone forecasts come from the Riverton office and carry a specific product identifier. This one had a product code I'd never seen before, ZFTWYS, and the issuing office field was blank. I almost deleted it. I receive occasional test products when NWS systems run diagnostics. They're usually marked test in the header. This one was. But its contents were specific enough that I read it fully. It predicted that beginning at approximately 2200 locale, sustained winds would increase to 45 knots from the west-southwest. Visibility would drop below 1/4 mile in blowing snow. Temperature would fall to minus 26 Celsius, and a rapid pressure drop would bring the barometer to 29.41 within a 90-minute window. I looked outside. The sky was perfectly clear. Winds were light. There was no frontal boundary within 500 miles of my position. I checked the 0600 upper air analysis from the Riverton sounding. Nothing. Checked the GFS model output from the overnight run. The 12-hour, 24-hour, and 48-hour forecasts all showed high pressure persisting over the region through Thursday. I assumed the product was a test or a misrouted file. I saved it to my local drive. That's standard practice when I receive anything anomalous, and continued my shift. At 14:30, I noticed the pressure had dropped from 29.8 to 29.77. Not alarming. Pressure drops happen. But the morning had been perfectly static, and this was the first movement in nearly 18 hours. I noted it. Filed my 1500 meter. At 1700, pressure was 29.71. Winds had shifted from west-northwest to west-southwest. Still light 12 knots. But the direction change was exactly what the anomalous forecast had specified. At 1900, pressure was 29.63. Winds were 22 knots, gusting to 30. Temperature had dropped 4 degrees in 2 hours. By 21:30, I could hear the wind against the residential module walls in a way that told me the gusts were above 40. I checked the ASOS, sustained at 38, gusting 51, visibility dropping. Blowing snow had started. At 2200, the exact hour the forecast had specified, sustained winds hit 45 knots. Visibility dropped below a 1/4 mile within 20 minutes. The temperature reading at 22:15 was minus 25 Celsius. By 2300, the barometer read 29.42, 1/10 of an inch off the forecast, over a 90-minute window, 14 hours before the atmosphere had shown any sign of producing these conditions. I sat at my terminal and reread the forecast product. Everything it described had occurred within the predicted window, to within measurement tolerance. Wind direction, speed, visibility, temperature, pressure, all confirmed. The only thing it had gotten wrong was the final barometric value, and it was wrong by 1/100th of an inch. Looking back, that should have bothered me more than it did. Not the accuracy, the near miss. 1/100th of an inch, as if it had been trying to be exact and fallen just short. as if precision was the goal and this was a rounding error. But I was tired, and storms in the Wind River Range in March are not extraordinary events. What was extraordinary was the forecast's existence, its timing, its specificity, its origin. I told myself the NWS was testing a new high-resolution model product and had accidentally routed it to my station's feed without proper headers. It was the only explanation that made mechanical sense. I recorded my end-of-shift summary at 23:30. Equipment status nominal despite high winds. Station secure, notable event, anomalous zone forecast product received at 07:40, accurately predicting current conditions. Save to local archive for follow-up with Riverton coordination. Surface observation complete. I went to bed. The storm blew itself out by morning. I filed my 0600 meter into a calm, clear dawn, pressure already recovering. I sent Jenna an email about the anomalous product, kept it brief and professional. Probably a test routing, I wrote, but the timing was odd. Could she check whether Riverton ran any experimental outputs yesterday morning? She replied 4 hours later. One sentence. Nothing experimental issued from this office in the last 72 hours. Send me the file. I sent it, and then I waited, because I didn't know what else to do. The data was clean. The storm had been real. The forecast had been right, and no one had sent it. The barometer that evening settled at 29.82 and held there through the night without a single fluctuation. 3 identical hourly readings in a row, and then 4, then 5. I watched the number sit on my screen and felt, for the first time, that it was watching back. Jenna called the next morning instead of emailing. That was unusual. In 4 months of coordination, she'd called me maybe 5 times always, for time-sensitive calibration issues or data outages. Everything else went through email. Garrett, I need to ask you something about this file. Her voice was level, but there was a tightness in it I hadn't heard before. When you say you received it at 0740, you mean that's when you opened it, or that's when it arrived? That's the receipt timestamp on the feed. I opened it a few minutes later. Okay. A pause. I could hear her keyboard. The file metadata says it was created at 0314 locale. That's before your ASOS even began its 0400 data cycle. There's no product in our system with the header ZFPWYS. I ran it through every issuing archive we have access to, national, regional, local. It doesn't exist as a product type. So it's a formatting error. Someone hand-typed a forecast and routed it to my... Garrett, the file wasn't routed. It was generated locally on your station's system. I didn't respond immediately because I didn't know what that meant. Your ASOS has a data generation function for outgoing metters and supplemental reports, she continued. It doesn't generate forecast products. It's not designed to. It doesn't have the software architecture for it. But this file was authored by your station's processor. The machine ID is in the metadata. I looked at my terminal. The ASOS interface sat in its standard monitoring mode, green text on black, numbers updating each minute. It was a reporting system. It measured, it transmitted, it did not predict. That's not possible, I said. I know. Could someone have accessed the terminal remotely and created a text file? Your station isn't networked for remote input. It transmits outward through the GOES satellite uplink. There's no inbound pathway for external file creation. I checked with IT in Silver Spring. They confirmed your ASOS cannot receive authored content, only firmware updates through a physical port. I was quiet for a long time. Jenna waited. What do you want me to do? I finally asked. Watch for it. If another one appears, don't delete it. Don't forward it. Just document the timestamp, save a local copy, and call me. I want to see if it recurs before I escalate this. I agreed. We hung up. I sat at the terminal for the rest of that morning, watching the data feed scroll. Nothing anomalous appeared. The sky was clear. Pressure held at 29.82 through my entire shift, which was now its 7th consecutive reading at that value. I logged each one. I verified each one against the manual mercury column. All identical. At the time, I thought the persistent pressure was a coincidence. A high-pressure system parked over the range with unusual stability. I was wrong about that part. It wasn't stability, it was waiting. 3 days passed without incident. I filed my meters, ran my calibration checks, recorded my shift summaries. The ASOS behaved normally. No anomalous products appeared. I started to relax into the explanation that the file had been a one-time system glitch, maybe a corrupted firmware string that had assembled itself into something resembling a coherent forecast by coincidence. Unlikely, but more possible than the alternative. On the 4th day, I decided to run an experiment. My shift observations are filed at standard synoptic hours, 0000, 0600, 1200, 1800 UTC. Between those hours, I also file specials when conditions change significantly. But the content of my observations is mine. I choose the remarks, the plain language summaries, the supplemental notes. No one dictates what I write beyond the formatting standards, so I decided to withhold my next 3 scheduled observations, not permanently. I'd file them late, backfilled, which is technically a procedural violation, but not one that triggers immediate review. I wanted to see if the system would generate another forecast product during a window when I wasn't actively feeding it data. I skipped my 1200 UTC observation, then my 1800, then my 0000. 12 hours of silence from my end. The ASOS continued its automated minute-by-minute cycle. It doesn't need me for that. But my augmented observations, my remarks, my voice recordings, those stopped. Nothing happened. No forecast product appeared. No anomalous file. The data feed showed only standard incoming products from Riverton, the routine area forecast. A couple of sigmets for aircraft icing to the north. I filed my backfilled observations at 0300 and went to bed feeling foolish. The next morning, 2 things were different. First, a new forecast product sat in my incoming feed. Same format as before, same blank issuing office, same unrecognized header, ZFPWYS, timestamped 0447 local, approximately 90 minutes before I woke. It described conditions for the next 48 hours, not 24, 48. Winds increasing to 60 knots from the northwest. Heavy snowfall accumulating 12 to 18 inches. Temperature dropping to minus 31. Onset time, 36 hours from the timestamp. Second, my barometer read 29.82. It had been reading 29.79 when I went to sleep. A small drop, normal overnight fluctuation. But the morning reading was 29.82 again, as if the instrument had been reset. I checked the ASOS log for the overnight hourly readings. They showed a steady value of 29.79 through 0200, then a single jump to 29.82 at 0300. The exact minute I had filed my backfilled observations. I sat with that for a long time. I called Jenna at 0830, told her about the second product, told her about the withholding experiment and the results, told her about the pressure correlation. You're saying the barometer changed when you filed? I'm saying the timestamp matches. I'm not saying they're connected, but you're thinking it. I didn't answer that. Garrett, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you sleeping okay up there? Eating regular? I'm not asking to be patronizing. I'm asking because isolation at altitude can produce perceptual disturbances that feel completely real. And Jenna, the file is on the system. You analyzed the first one yourself. The metadata confirmed local generation. I'm not hallucinating text files. Another silence. When she spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, more careful. I know you're not. I'm sorry. I was reaching for the easy answer. A breath. Okay, new product. 48-hour lead time, same impossible origin. What does it predict? I read her the forecast verbatim. She pulled up the current model guidance while I waited. There's nothing, she said. GFS shows high pressure, continuing through the weekend. NAM agrees. Euro agrees. There is no storm system within 1,000 miles of your station in any model run from the last 24 hours. The first one was right. I know. What if this one is too? She didn't answer for several seconds. Then we have a problem I don't have a framework for. But Garrett, don't do anything yet. Don't report this upward. Let me check something on my end. I want to look at the data files your station has generated over the past 6 months, all of them, not just the anomalous products. The routine matters too. I want to run a comparison. Comparison against what? Against the forecast products. I want to see if there are any textual overlaps I missed. I told her I'd send everything. I spent that afternoon exporting 6 months of station-generated files. Every meter, every supplemental observation, every shift summary recording, and uploaded them to the shared coordination server. It took 3 hours on the satellite link. The next morning, still 30 hours before the forecasted storm onset, the sky was clear and the wind was calm. Nothing in the atmosphere suggested violence. I checked the models again. High pressure everywhere. No moisture, no dynamics, no energy. The forecast sitting on my drive described a blizzard that physics had no intention of producing. At 1400, Jenna called again. Garrett, I found something. I need you to listen carefully because I don't fully understand what I'm looking at. Go ahead. I compared the text of both forecast products, the first one from Tuesday and the new one, against your archived shift summary recordings, specifically the spoken audio files you record at end of shift. Okay. The first forecast product, the one that predicted the Tuesday storm, contains 3 sentences that are identical, word for word, to your end of shift summary recorded on Tuesday night after the storm arrived. The summary you recorded at 23:30, confirming what you observed. I felt something cold settle into the base of my skull. Garrett, the forecast was generated 14 hours before you recorded that summary, but it contains your exact words from that summary. Your phrasing, your sentence structure, including one specific observation about the pressure drop rate that you wouldn't have known to make until the event was already occurring. That's not, I know it's not possible, but I've checked the text 3 times. I've listened to your audio recording 4 times. They match. Not paraphrased, not similar, identical, your exact words. I looked at the terminal, at the new forecast product sitting there, waiting. 48 hours of future weather, described with the same clinical precision as the first. And somewhere inside it, I now understood, were words I hadn't spoken yet, descriptions of conditions I hadn't observed yet, phrases I would only think to use once the storm was real and I was standing inside it recording what I saw. The file creation date was 04:47 this morning. The storm was scheduled for tomorrow night, and the forecast already knew what I would say about it. Jenna, I said carefully, what are the file creation dates on my older meters? The routine ones from the past 6 months? She was quiet for too long. Some of them predate your employment start, Garrett. I thought it was a system clock error, but it's not all of them. Only the ones filed during events. Storms, high winds, temperature extremes, those files, 23 of them were created between 1 and 7 days before the events they describe, before I observed them, before they happened. I ended the call, sat at my desk, looked at the barometer, 29.82. Outside, the wind was perfectly still, and the sky was the deep, empty blue that only exists at altitude in winter. Nothing moved. Nothing suggested that in 30 hours, 60-knot winds would reshape the snowpack across 20 miles of ridgeline. But the forecast was already written, and apparently so were my words. I spent the rest of that afternoon reading the new forecast product line by line, looking for my voice inside it. The document was approximately 400 words. Standard zone forecast structure, period-by-period breakdown of expected conditions, plain language summary, quantitative values for wind, temperature, visibility, precipitation. Most of it was formatted in the impersonal register that NWS products use, but embedded within the plain language sections were phrases that I recognized, not because I'd read them before, because they sounded like me. Rapid onset consistent with downslope acceleration. That was a phrase I used, specifically me. I'd written it in reports going back to my Riverton days. Most forecasters would say sudden wind increase associated with mountain wave activity or something structurally different. Rapid onset consistent with downslope acceleration was mine. Visibility reduction near instantaneous with precipitation onset, also mine. My specific way of noting that the snow and the visibility loss arrived simultaneously rather than one preceding the other. There were 4 phrases like that in the document. 4 places where the clinical language broke into something personal, something that could only have come from a trained observer who structured sentences the way I do, who used consistent with as a connector, who favored near instantaneous over sudden. I was reading a document authored by my own future mouth. The storm was still 28 hours away. The sky was still clear. The models still showed nothing. I had 28 hours to decide what to do with that knowledge and specifically whether I could change it. Here was my thinking. If the forecast contained my words, then those words must come from somewhere. Either the system was extracting them from my existing recordings, assembling future documents from my archived vocabulary, or it was somehow receiving my actual future speech before I produced it. The first explanation was strange but mechanically conceivable. A sufficiently advanced text generation system could theoretically construct sentences and filed hundreds of. The raw material existed. The second explanation, actual precognition, I wasn't ready to accept. So I designed a test. Simple, direct. When the storm arrived and I recorded my end-of-shift summary, I would deliberately avoid every phrase that appeared in the forecast. I would describe the same conditions using completely different language, different sentence structures, different terminology. If the forecast had assembled my words from existing patterns, then my deviation would break the correspondence. The forecast would be wrong not about the weather, but about me. I wrote down the 4 phrases on a note card and taped it above my desk, my avoidance list. I would not say rapid onset consistent with downslope acceleration. I would not say visibility reduction near instantaneous with precipitation onset. I would not use consistent with as a connector at all. I would speak in short, simple declarations. Subject, verb, object. Nothing that sounded like my professional register. I felt almost good about it. Like I'd found the edge of the problem and could push against it. I was wrong about that too. The next day passed in ordinary routine. Morning observation, calibration check, data review. The sky stayed clear until mid-afternoon when a thin veil of cirrus appeared from the west, the first visual indication that moisture was moving into the region. I noted it. Still no model support for a significant event. The GFS had shifted slightly in its overnight run, now showing a weak trough approaching from the Pacific, but nothing that would produce 60-knot winds or 18 inches of snow. The trough was too flat, too fast-moving. By evening, the cirrus had thickened. Pressure had begun to drop, 29.78 at my 1800 observation. A measurable decline from the static 29.82 that had held for days. The atmosphere was moving again. Whether it was moving toward what the forecast described, I couldn't tell yet. I recorded my evening shift summary at 2200, kept it brief, equipment nominal, cirrus overcast building, pressure trending downward, surface observation complete. I caught myself on that last phrase. The forecast didn't contain it, I'd checked, but I still felt a small involuntary hesitation before saying it, as if the words had more weight now, as if they were doing something besides marking the end of my shift. I went to bed at 2300 with the note card on my desk, and the storm still 16 hours away. It arrived early. I woke at 0340 to the sound of the module walls flexing. Not creaking, flexing. The kind of pressure differential you get when wind loads exceed 50 knots against a flat surface. I was out of bed and at the terminal in under a minute. ASOS showed sustained winds at 53 knots. Gusting 67. Visibility, 1/8 of a mile. Temperature, minus 28 Celsius. The onset had occurred sometime around 0300, nearly 5 hours ahead of the forecasted timeline. I want to be precise about what happened next. because this is where I started to lose my certainty about the test. The storm was early. The forecast said onset at 2200 the following evening. It arrived at 0300. That's a 19-hour discrepancy, a significant error. I felt a brief, sharp relief. The forecast was wrong. It had the conditions right, but the timing wrong. Maybe it was just an unusually good pattern matching system with an imperfect temporal model. But as I stood at the terminal reading the real-time data, I realized the conditions were exact, not approximately correct. Exact. 60 knot sustained winds. The forecast said 60. The ASOS showed 53, sustained with 67 gusts, which averages to the forecast value. Temperature minus 28 within 3 degrees. Visibility below 1/4 mile. Precipitation heavy. These weren't in the ballpark. They were within instrument tolerance. Only the timing was wrong. And even as I thought that, I noticed the pressure reading on my screen. 29.41. The forecast had predicted 29.41 as the low pressure value. And there it was, exactly on my barometer. Except the first forecast last week's had also predicted 29.41, and the actual reading that night had been 29.42, 100th off. I'd noted it at the time as a near miss. Now a second event was hitting 29.41 precisely. And then I looked at the event timestamp more carefully. The ASOS logs showed the pressure bottoming at 29.41 at exactly 0314 local 0314, the creation timestamp of the first anomalous forecast, the one from last week, generated at 0314. I don't know how to explain what it felt like to see that number in two places that shouldn't connect. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the feeling of a pattern locking into place, of seeing a mechanism where you'd only seen data, like watching gears engage from inside the machine. The storm raged until mid-morning. By 0900, winds were diminishing. By 1100, the sky was breaking. I filed my observations throughout routine mechanical, focused on the work. I did not record my end-of-shift summary. I couldn't, not yet, because the note card was still on my desk, and the phrases were still there, and I still had my plan. But the storm had arrived early, which meant my recording window was now. If I was going to test whether my language could deviate from the forecast, I had to speak now. I sat at my desk with the recorder running. I described the event in the simplest language I could manage. Short sentences, no connectors, no professional register. Wind reached 60 knots. Snow started at the same time as visibility dropped. Temperature went to minus 28. Pressure hit bottom at 2941. Storm came early 5 hours ahead of any guidance. I paused, looked at the note card. None of my forbidden phrases. Nothing resembling rapid onset consistent with downslope acceleration. Nothing like visibility reduction near instantaneous with precipitation onset. I felt the relief again. Stronger this time. I had deviated. The forecast contained my words, but I had said different words. The correspondence was broken. Surface observation complete. I saved the recording, exported, opened the forecast product on my screen and reread it, looking for the phrases I'd avoided. They weren't there. I read it again. The 4 phrases I'd written on my note card, the ones I'd identified yesterday as my distinctive language, the ones I'd been so certain were embedded in the forecast, they were gone. The document still said the same things, still described the same conditions, but the language was different now. Simple, short, declarative. Wind reached 60 knots. Snow started at the same time as visibility dropped. My words. The words I had just spoken 60 seconds ago, choosing them deliberately to be different from what the forecast had said. The forecast now said what I had said. It read exactly as I had just spoken, as if it had always said that, as if the version I'd read yesterday, the one with my professional phrasing, had never existed. I checked the file properties. Creation date, 447 2 days ago. Unmodified. No edit history, no revision timestamp. The file was original and untouched, and it contained the exact sentences I had spoken 1 minute before opening it. The note card was still on my desk. I could see my own handwriting. Rapid onset, consistent with downslope acceleration. The phrase I'd been so certain was in the forecast. The phrase I'd built my entire test around avoiding. Either I had misread the document yesterday, misremembered it, projected my own expected language onto a text that had always been simpler than I thought, or the file had changed. I picked up the phone and called Jenna. It rang 6 times before she answered. "I need you to open the second forecast product," I said. "The one I sent you. The 48-hour one." "Okay, hold on." Keyboard sounds. A pause. "I have it. Read me the 3rd paragraph. The plain language summary." She read it. Word for word, it matched my record. My simple, deliberate, stripped-down phrasing, chosen specifically to deviate from what I'd read in the document 2 days ago. "Jenna, when you first opened that file, do you remember what it said?" "What do you mean?" "It says what it says. I'm reading it." "I mean, did it sound like me when you first read it? Did you notice my phrasing in it?" A long silence. "Garrett, I'm not sure what you're asking. The language is pretty standard. It sounds like an observation summary. It sounds like you, but that's because it contains your station data." "Why?" She didn't remember it being different. She'd analyzed. She'd specifically told me she found textual overlaps between the forecast and my recordings. She'd identified the correspondence. And now the file read differently, and she didn't remember the original version. I thanked her, hung up, sat at my desk, looking at the note card, covered in phrases that no longer existed anywhere except in my handwriting. I changed my end-of-shift phrase that night. Instead of surface observation complete, I said, "Shift closing, all readings confirmed." A small thing, arbitrary, but deliberately different. The next morning, a new forecast product was waiting in my feed. I opened it before I checked anything else. Scrolled to the final line. "Shift closing, all readings confirmed." Dated 3 days before I'd decided to change the phrase. Created before the decision existed in my mind. The file knew what I would say, not because it predicted me, because whatever I chose to say became what it had always contained. The document didn't change to match my future. My future had always been what the document said. The correspondence was perfect because it couldn't be broken. Every deviation I attempted was already the version that had always existed. I couldn't outspeak it. I couldn't surprise it. Every word I chose had already been chosen. And outside my window, the sky was clear, the wind was still, and the barometer read 29.82, holding steady as if waiting for me to tell it what to do next. I stopped filing at noon the next day. No meter at 1200 UTC. No supplemental observations. No shift summary. No spoken recording. I powered down my terminal, disconnected the audio recorder, and sat in the residential module with a cup of coffee and a view of a sky that was doing nothing. I want to be clear about my reasoning. I was not panicking. I was not acting impulsively. I had a specific hypothesis, and I needed to test it, even if the test meant violating my contract and potentially triggering a data outage alarm at Riverton. The hypothesis was this: if the forecast contained my words because my words were the mechanism, if my observations were somehow authoring the conditions they described, then removing my observation should remove the no speech, no weather, no human language to serve as a template, no atmospheric event to fulfill it. It was absurd. I knew it was absurd. The atmosphere doesn't care whether a single observer at 9,240 feet files a report or stays silent. Weather is physics, pressure gradients, moisture transport, thermal dynamics. It doesn't require permission. It doesn't need to be narrated into existence. But the forecasts were impossible too. And they were real, so I sat and I watched. The first 6 hours were nothing. Clear sky, light winds, temperature steady. The ASOS continued its automated cycle, taking readings, storing them locally but without my augmented observations feeding into the outgoing data stream. The station was effectively mute. It measured, but it did not speak. By evening, Jenna called. I let it ring. She called again 20 minutes later. I let that ring too. She sent an email at 19:30. "Garrett, your 1,200 and 1,800 meters are missing. Equipment issue? Call me." I didn't respond. I slept that night without recording a shift summary. First time in 4 months. It felt like leaving a door unlocked, a small, persistent wrongness at the edge of consciousness. But I committed to it. The second day of silence was when I noticed. I woke at 0500, made coffee, walked to the window. The sky was clear. The wind was calm. The temperature reading on my wall-mounted thermometer showed -12, exactly what it had been the previous morning. I checked the ASOS data log for the overnight readings. Every hourly value was identical to the previous night's hourly values. Not similar, identical. Same temperatures, same wind speeds, same directions, same pressure. The atmosphere had repeated itself exactly across a 24-hour period. I assumed instrument failure, multiple simultaneous sensor faults, producing cloned data. Unlikely but not impossible after a power fluctuation or firmware glitch. I went outside to verify manually. The temperature was -12. I checked the mercury barometer, 29.82. I looked at the wind vane. It pointed west-northwest, barely moving, consistent with the automated reading. I looked at the sky. Clear, high, thin cirrus, far to the south, exactly where it had been yesterday morning. Not approximately where it had been exactly. The same filament shapes in the same positions. The same gap between them. The same slight curl at the leading edge of the western strand. I watched those clouds for 40 minutes. They didn't move. Nothing moved. The air felt dense and held, like the inside of a sealed room. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear my heartbeat. I could not hear wind. Not a whisper of it, despite the vane showing 8 knots from the west-northwest. The instruments said there was wind. My skin said there was nothing. I went back inside and checked the ASOS precipitation log. 0. Humidity log. Constant visibility unrestricted. Every parameter locked in place, repeating the same values minute after minute, and now hour after hour. Identical to the previous day. The atmosphere wasn't changing because no one was telling it to. I sat with that thought for a long time. I didn't believe it. I want to be honest about that. I didn't believe it in the way you believe something you verified and accepted. I believed it the way you believe something that fits the evidence but makes you feel sick. A belief held at arm's length. A belief you keep testing because you need it to be wrong. I checked the data feed for incoming products. Nothing anomalous. No ZFPWYS forecast. No mysterious file. The system was empty. No forecast had been generated because if my hypothesis was correct, there was nothing to forecast. No future event to describe. No observation to contain. No voice to quote. The sky was on hold, waiting for input. At 1400, Jenna called again. This time I answered. Garrett, what's going on? You've missed 4 filing windows. I need to know if this is a system outage or... Jenna, what does your satellite imagery show over my station right now? What? Visible satellite? What does the current image look like? A pause. Typing. Clear. High pressure. Some cirrus to your south. Why? What did it look like yesterday at this time? More typing. A longer pause. Garrett, that's It looks the same, but that's not unusual for a stagnant high-pressure pattern. You can get days of nearly identical satellite presentations when not nearly identical. Pull up yesterday's 1400 image and today's 1400 image side by side. Look at the cirrus formation south of my position. I could hear her doing it. The silence lasted nearly a minute. That's the same image, she said slowly. It's not the same image. It's 2 images taken 24 hours apart. Check the timestamps. I see the timestamps. They're different days. Her voice had changed, gotten quieter, more careful. But the cloud formations they're in the same positions, the same shapes. That's not possible. I know. Garrett, what's happening? I stopped filing observations 30 hours ago. I haven't spoken a single weather report since yesterday at noon. And the atmosphere over my station has been perfectly static ever since, repeating the same conditions, frozen in place. She didn't respond. I think my observations aren't describing the weather, Jenna. I think they're generating it. I think when I file a report, when I speak conditions into the record, those conditions become real. And when I stop speaking, nothing happens. Nothing new. The system just holds the last state. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. She stopped. Started again. Garrett, listen to me. I need you to file an observation. Why? Because if you're right, then you've stopped the weather over a significant geographic area and I need to know the boundaries. But if you're wrong, if this is a sensor failure or a psychological episode, then filing a routine observation will prove it. File something boring. File clear skies and light winds. If the weather doesn't change, then your hypothesis is wrong and we're dealing with a technical problem. If it does change, she didn't finish. I thought about it. She was right in a limited sense. A test observation would confirm or deny the mechanism. If I filed a report saying exactly what was already happening, clear sky, light wind, -12, pressure 29.82, and nothing changed, then I was wrong, and the static atmosphere was coincidence or equipment failure. But if I filed a report describing something different, something that wasn't currently occurring and it came true, what if I describe something that isn't happening? I said. What? If I file an observation that says conditions are different from what I see, if I report wind that isn't there, or precipitation that doesn't exist, and then those conditions appear, don't. Her voice was sharp, immediate. Garrett, don't do that. If there's even a 1% chance you're right about this, you do not describe conditions you can't verify. You do not put words into the record that aren't already true. Do you understand me? I understood her. And she was right to say it. But the fact that she said it, the fact that she immediately grasped the danger of false reporting in this context, told me she believed my hypothesis more than she was willing to state. I'll file a standard observation. I said exactly what I see, nothing more. Okay, call me after. I hung up. I walked to the window. Clear sky, light wind. -12, 29.82. I sat down at the terminal and typed a standard meter. Meter KWYS 1819, OOZ 2908K, T10 SMC LRM12/M18, A2982RM KA02 clear. Winds west-northwest at 8 knots. Visibility 10 miles, temperature -12, pressure 29.82. Exactly what I observed. Exactly what had been true for 30 hours. I transmitted it. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. I watched the ASOS readings, same values, same static repetition. I started to feel the specific relief of being wrong, the comfort of discovering that you are merely paranoid and the universe operates by its own rules, regardless of your participation. At the 22-minute mark, the wind speed ticked from 8 to 9 knots, a single knot increase, meaningless in isolation. But it was the first change in any parameter in over 30 hours, and it occurred 22 minutes after my first observation filing in that window. Over the next hour, the readings began to shift. Small movements. Wind direction rotating slowly clockwise. Temperature dropping half a degree. Pressure beginning a subtle decline. 29.81, then 29.80. The atmosphere was moving again. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but moving in ways it had not moved during my silence. I had described clear skies and light wind, and clear skies and light wind were continuing but with life in them now, with variation, with the subtle dynamism that normal weather always has. The system had received my input and resumed operation, not creating a storm, not generating violence, just running again. At 2100, my data feed chimed with an incoming product, ZFPWYS, blank issuing office, locally generated, creation timestamp, 1922, 22 minutes after my transmitted meter. I opened it. A 48-hour forecast, winds increasing to 75 knots, extreme cold, blowing snow, visibility near zero, duration 14 hours. Onset 41 hours from now. And in the plain language section in my phrasing and my sentence structure, A description of conditions more severe than anything I'd observed in 4 months at this station. 75 knots was beyond damaging. It was structural. At minus 34, exposed skin would freeze in under 10 minutes. The forecast described conditions that would be dangerous to me personally inside the residential module if they lasted more than a few hours. I hadn't described these conditions. I'd filed a clear sky observation. I'd reported what was happening, not what would happen. But the system had taken my voice, my resumed participation, and used it to author something I never said. My observation hadn't just restarted the atmosphere. It had given the system permission to write again, and what it wrote was worse than before. I called Jenna. She answered on the first ring. It generated a new forecast. I said 75 knots, minus 34, 41 hours from now. Garrett, I only filed what I saw. Clear sky, light winds. I didn't describe anything severe, but it used my filing as, an activation, a door opening. My voice went back into the system and the system wrote something new, something I didn't say. What are you going to do? I looked at the forecast on my screen. 41 hours, a little under 2 days. If the previous 2 forecasts were any guide, the conditions would be exactly as described within instrument tolerance. I don't know yet, I said. But Jenna, when I wasn't filing, the weather stopped. When I filed again, it restarted and immediately escalated. What happens if I keep filing? What happens if you stop again and it stays frozen forever? I hadn't thought about that. A permanently static atmosphere over a mountain range in Wyoming. No weather, no storms, no cycles, no snowmelt feeding rivers in spring, no precipitation replenishing groundwater. A dead spot in the climate system, held in stasis because one man stopped talking. That's not, I started. It might be exactly the problem, she said quietly. Garrett, you said other stations in the network. You asked me weeks ago about historical data anomalies. I've been looking. I need to tell you something. Tell me. 3 other cooperative stations in the western region have had extended data gaps in the past 10 years. 1 in Montana, 2 in Colorado. Each gap lasted between 72 hours and 9 days. During each gap, the stations filed nothing, no meters, no supplementals, nothing. And during each gap, the regional climate data shows anomalous stability in the immediate vicinity of that station. Pressure holding constant, temperatures repeating, satellite imagery showing identical cloud formations day after day. What ended the gaps? The observers resumed filing in every case. And in every case, within 48 hours of resumption, a significant weather event occurred in the station's coverage area. How significant? She was quiet for a moment. 2 produced damage. One of the Colorado events was a wind event that destroyed a communication tower 12 miles from the station. The Montana event produced an avalanche cycle that closed a highway for 2 weeks. And before the gaps, were there forecast products like mine? I don't know. The observers at those stations are no longer employed by the cooperative program. I've requested their archived files, but the data management office says the local records were corrupted during system migrations. Corrupted? That's what they said. I looked at the barometer. 29.79. Dropping. The atmosphere was in motion again and it had somewhere to go. Jenna, if I stop again, if I go silent and the weather freezes, is that better or worse than letting this event happen? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. But Garrett, if you stop and it holds, for how long? Forever? Can you stay silent for the rest of your life? Can whoever replaces you? She was right. The silence was temporary, unsustainable. Eventually someone would speak. Eventually the system would receive input and resume. And the longer the silence held, the worse the resumption seemed to be. The forecast sat on my screen, waiting. 40 hours now. 75 knots. Minus 34. My words in the document, though I'd never spoken them. My phrasing describing conditions I hadn't requested, predicting observations I hadn't yet made. But I would make them. When the storm arrived, if it arrived, I would observe it. I would measure it. I would file my readings. And in that filing, I would speak the words the forecast already contained. Complete the circuit. Confirm what had already been written, unless I could find a way to speak without confirming. To observe without authorizing. I didn't sleep well that night. The wind was building outside, nothing severe yet, just the slow clockwise rotation that precedes a frontal passage in the northern Rockies. Normal dynamics. The kind of thing I'd observed 1,000 times. But this time I knew it wasn't arriving. It was being delivered. 31 hours before the forecasted event, I made a decision that I will spend the rest of my career questioning. I decided to file. Not because I wanted the storm. Not because I'd accepted the system, because Jenna was right. Silence wasn't sustainable, and every precedent suggested that prolonged silence produced worse outcomes upon resumption. The Montana station's 9-day gap had ended in an avalanche cycle. The Colorado gap produced structural wind damage. My 30-hour silence had already escalated the next forecast from 60 knots to 75. If I went quiet again for days, for weeks, what would the system write when someone finally spoke? So I would speak, but I would speak carefully. My reasoning was this: the forecast contained my words, my exact phrasing, my exact descriptions. If my language was the template, if the atmosphere shaped itself to match my observations, then perhaps the specific content of my observations mattered. Perhaps I could describe less, understate, file reports that were technically accurate but deliberately restrained. Report wind at 50 knots instead of 75, if 50 was what I could honestly observe at any single moment during a gust lull. Report visibility at a quarter mile instead of near zero if I could catch one instant of partial clearing. Stay true to what I measured, but choose my measurement windows carefully. Choose which truths to speak. It was the only form of agency I could think of that didn't require silence or dishonesty. I wouldn't fabricate. I wouldn't invent calm conditions that didn't exist. But I would observe selectively. I would report the least severe, truthful snapshot I could find within each filing window. I spent the next 24 hours preparing. I reviewed my observation protocols, the specific rules about what constitutes a representative observation. The guidelines are clear. You report the prevailing condition, not the momentary fluctuation. If wind is sustained at 60 but dips to 45 for 3 seconds, you report 60. If visibility is below a quarter mile for 55 minutes of the hour but briefly clears to a half mile for 5 minutes, you report the prevailing value. But prevailing has always involved judgment. It's never been perfectly objective. There's a window of interpretation in every observation, and I intended to use it. I also prepared physically, secured the external equipment, brought the backup generator online, filled every water container in the module, checked the satellite phone battery. If 75-knot winds hit this module, I'd be safe. The structure was rated for mountain conditions, but I'd lose power if the primary line went down, and I needed the generator to maintain my filing capability. At 1800 the day before the forecasted onset, the first signs appeared. Pressure dropping steadily, 29.68, then 29.61. Wind increasing from the southwest, now gusting above 30. Clouds building rapidly, the sky going from scattered cumulus to full overcast in less than 2 hours. Everything consistent with the early stages of a major mountain windstorm. Everything matching the forecast progression exactly. And I filed my 1800 meter. Accurate, restrained. I reported gusts to 32, the value I'd observed during a specific 3-second averaging period. The ASOS had recorded a gust to 38 in the same window. Both were true. I chose the lower one. I chose my words carefully for the remarks section. Conditions deteriorating gradually. Frontal passage expected overnight. Gradually expected. Words that implied normalcy. A routine frontal passage. Not a 75-knot event, not a dangerous storm. Just weather. I filed it and waited. By midnight, I knew my approach had limitations. The wind was at 54 knots sustained, gusting above 60. The module was shaking not dangerously but persistently, a low-frequency vibration I could feel in my chest. Snow was horizontal outside the windows, and the ASOS visibility sensor read 1/16 of a mile. Temperature had dropped to -29. I filed my 0000 meter. I reported sustained wind at 48, catching a brief lull in the averaging window. Visibility, 1/8 mile. I'd seen a momentary improvement around 23:45. Temperature -27. The sensor had shown that value for perhaps 4 minutes before dropping further. All true. All the gentlest edge of what I could honestly report. And for 2 hours, the conditions seemed to hold at approximately those values. The wind didn't exceed 55 sustained. The temperature held near -29, but didn't drop further. Visibility stayed miserable but stable. I allowed myself to think it was working, that my restraint was producing restraint, that the storm was calibrating itself to my reports, rather than to the forecast 75 knot prediction. At 0200, I filed a supplemental observation. I chose my words with extreme care. Short sentences, modest values. I reported what I could honestly defend as the representative condition of that specific minute. Winds 50 knots sustained. Temperature -29. Heavy snow. Visibility 1/8 mile. Station secure. I did not say 75 knots. I did not say -34. I did not use the phrasing that was in the forecast. I spoke a smaller storm into the record. And for the next 3 hours, a smaller storm is what I got. The ASOS data during that window showed conditions oscillating around my reported values. Wind peaking at 52, occasionally 54, then dropping back. Temperature fluctuating between -28 and -30. Visibility varying between 1/16 and 1/8 of a mile. The storm was real and severe, but it was operating within the bounds I had spoken, not the forecast's bounds. Mine. At 0500, I almost stopped. Almost declared the experiment a success. Almost believed I had found the mechanism's constraint, that my observations overrode the forecast, that my spoken values were more authoritative than the pre-written one. But I needed to file my end-of-shift summary. And the moment I thought about it, the moment I imagined speaking those final words into the recorder, I realized I didn't know what to say. The forecast product was still on my screen. I opened it again for the first time since the storm began. The plain language section had changed. Not dramatically, not entirely, but the values were different than I remembered. Where it had said 75 knots, it now said 52. Where it had said -34, it now said -29. Where it had described near zero visibility, it now described 1/8 mile. My values, my observations, replacing what had been there before. The forecast, rewriting itself to match what I had spoken, just as it had done with my shift phrases, just as it had done when I tried to deviate from its language. I hadn't constrained the storm. I hadn't moderated anything. The forecast had simply adjusted to contain whatever I said. My careful observations hadn't limited the weather. They'd become the weather, and the forecast had retroactively accommodated as if they'd always been the plan. The document was still perfect, still accurate, still containing my exact words before I'd spoken. The system didn't care whether I spoke big storms or small ones, only cared that I spoke. I sat back in my chair and felt something I can only describe as moral virtue. For 5 hours, I believed I was exercising restraint, moderating out, holding back the worst. And instead, I'd been performing exactly the function the system required, speaking conditions into the record, providing the human voice that authorized atmospheric events to occur. The specific content was irrelevant. The scale was irrelevant. What mattered was participation. What mattered was that a trained observer filed an observation and said, "This is what is happening." Because that statement, whatever it contained, came the thing that happened. I recorded my shift summary at 0530. I didn't try to be clever. I didn't try to be minimal. I described what I saw in the language that came naturally because choosing different language had never changed anything except the forecast text. Significant wind event, peak sustained near 52 knots. Temperature dropped to -29. Heavy snowfall with restricted visibility throughout. Station secure, no equipment damage. Surface observation complete. The words left my mouth and I felt them go somewhere. Not out into the satellite uplink, Not toward Riverton or the national data stream. Somewhere else. Into the structure of whatever read my voice and made it real. The storm ended by noon. The sky cleared. The wind dropped below 15 knots, and the temperature began its slow recovery. By my 1800 observation, conditions were calm. Pressure was climbing. 29.82. It settled there like an anchor finding bottom, holding, stable, the resting state, the system idle, waiting for new input. Jenna called that evening. I told her everything. The restraint experiment, the apparent moderation, the forecast's self-correction, the understanding I'd reached. She listened without interrupting for nearly 10 minutes. When I finished, she asked one question. Garrett, if the scale doesn't matter, if whatever you say becomes true, regardless of magnitude, then what happens if you describe something catastrophic? I wouldn't. I know you wouldn't. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether the system has an upper limit, whether there's something you could say that it wouldn't produce, or whether your voice authorizes anything without constraint. I didn't have an answer, because if it's the second one, she continued very quietly, then you're not a weather observer. You're a safety valve. You're the only thing between that system and whatever the maximum output is. And as long as you keep speaking moderate conditions into the record, even if the system adjusts to match, you're still choosing the scale. You just can't verify that your choice matters. Or I'm not choosing anything, and the system would produce exactly what it produces regardless of my language. You can't know that either? No, I couldn't. That was 3 weeks ago. I'm still here. I still file my meters every 6 hours, and I still record my shift summaries. I still say surface observation complete at the end of each one, and I still feel those words travel somewhere that isn't on any network diagram. The forecasts still appear. Every 2 to 4 days, a ZFPWYS product generates on my system, describing conditions 48 to 72 hours ahead. They always contain my voice. They always prove perfectly accurate. The storms they describe arrive exactly as written, or rather, I observe them exactly as written, and I can no longer tell the difference. I file moderate language, always. I choose the gentlest, honest truth available to me at each observation window. I report the low end of every range. I understate when I can defend understating. I don't know if it helps. I don't know if the storms I'm experiencing are the moderated versions or the only versions that were ever going to occur. I don't know if my restraint is a real function or a comfortable belief the system allows me to hold because it keeps me filing. Jenna monitors my outputs. She doesn't tell me what the other stations are doing. I've stopped asking. But once last week, she said something that I think about every morning when I wake up and check the barometer. The 3 other stations that went through this, the ones with the data gaps, she said, they all went quiet eventually. The observers all left, and the weather resumed without them. Different observers, different voices, same cycle. What are you telling me? I'm telling you that you're not irreplaceable, Garrett. The system doesn't need you. It needs a voice. If you leave, someone else will come. Someone who files routinely and doesn't know what they're authorizing. Someone who won't choose their words carefully. Someone who might describe what they see without thinking about what their description produces. She let that settle. You're the only observer in the network who knows what's happening. The only one who might be limiting the output through deliberate choice. If that choice matters, even if you can't prove it, is that a reason to stay, or a reason the system would want you to believe you should? I don't know. I have never known. Every morning I wake up, check the barometer, 29.82, always 29.82, the resting tone of whatever this is, and I sit at my terminal and I file my observation. I choose my words. I say them into the recorder. I feel them go, and outside the weather comes. Yesterday's forecast is on my screen now. 72-hour lead time, the longest yet. It describes a wind event that would be severe. 68 knots, heavy snow, minus 31. Significant but survivable. I've seen worse in the forecasts, or I've spoken worse into being. I can't separate those anymore. But there's something new in this one. At the bottom, below the standard forecast text, below my phrases and my phrasing, and my specific professional voice, rendered in a document that predates my reading of it. A single line I haven't seen before. Extended outlook, 29.82 through indefinite hold. Resume pending next qualified observer. I read it 4 times and then I looked at the barometer. Still 29.82, still holding. The system is telling me what happens when I leave. It holds. It waits. And then it resumes with the next person who sits in this chair and speaks conditions into the record without knowing their voice is the authorization. I could quit tomorrow, walk down the mountain when the road opens in April, let the next contractor take the station, let them file their routine observations into a system they don't understand, authorizing weather they can't control with language they haven't chosen carefully. Or I can stay, keep speaking, keep choosing, keep filing the moderate truth and hoping without evidence, without verification, without any way to measure my own effectiveness, that my careful words are holding something back. The forecast knows what I'll decide. It already contains my next shift summary. It already has my words from tomorrow. I could open it and read my own future spoken aloud in my own voice, transcribed before I think it. I don't open it. That's the only freedom I have left. The choice not to read ahead. To let my next observation be mine for the 30 seconds between speaking it and discovering it was always there. I checked the barometer one more time before I begin. 29.82. I press record.